Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. When it comes to the feast days of the Jews, we can find almost all of them laid out for us in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We have studied them extensively in previous studies, so if you want a refresher on them, we invite you to go back and listen to those studies. However, I did say almost all of the feast days could be found there. The origin of one, the Feast of Hanukkah, which is mentioned in the book of John, is not found in inspired scripture, but found in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, two uninspired apocryphal books that is added by some Catholics and some Protestants to the Old Testament. It's not that the origin of this feast is non-historical, it's that this book is uninspired, hence why it is not in many non-Catholic Old Testaments today. The second feast that is not found there is one that is in inspired scripture, right here in the book of Esther, the Feast of Purim. Let's see what this feast commemorates. If you have a Bible with you, turn to the book of Esther to chapter 9. We're going to be reading from verses 18 to 32. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Esther chapter 9, beginning at verse 18. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th day, and on the 15th day of the month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote those things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month of which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. The entire narrative of the book of Esther surrounds the salvation of the Jews from annihilation by Haman, an evil advisor to the king of Persia. His plot had been exposed, albeit too late for the king's edict to be reversed, and Haman has been killed, but a second edict allowed the Jews to defend themselves, which they successfully did. And as is the case with many great military victories of a nation, a day of remembrance, and sometimes celebration, is had to remind future generations of past events. VE Day is still celebrated in Europe every May 8th, marking the end of World War II, and in the year of the publication of this lesson, it will be celebrated for the 80th time in 2025. Americans joyously celebrate Independence Day on July 4th each year and have done so for 249 years as of the publication of this lesson. And other countries celebrate other days of significance, either civically or militarily. Such was going to be true for the Jews concerning what happened on this day. The feast would be known as Purim, named after the pur, or the lot, that was used by Haman in order to determine the day that the Jews were to be exterminated. Instead of being exterminated, though, the Jews were saved from annihilation, so each year on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, the Jews would commemorate this deliverance as a time of feasting, a remembrance of when the Jews had rest from their enemies and when their sorrow was turned to joy. But this feast wouldn't simply be a one-year feast, or a feast that would only last until the generation that experienced it died out. No, this was to be a perpetual feast, observed every year by the Jews throughout all their generations, with instructions given by Esther and Mordecai that was sent to the Jewish populations throughout the entire empire. And have the Jews kept this feast since then? Yes, and is still commemorated today. In fact, this lesson is being first published on March 1st, 2025, and in 12 days is the Feast of Purim, which will be held by the Jews for this year. And if our dating of the book is correct as it concerns Ahasuerus being Xerxes I, that means that the Feast of Purim will be 1 year short of 2,500 years of celebration. With this being a feast of deliverance, that would make the Feast of Purim a similar remembrance to that of the Feast of Passover and Unleavened Bread, which commemorated Israel's deliverance from Egypt. But even with this being so, in Scripture, the Feast of Purim wasn't elevated to be a feast of the Lord, just as Hanukkah wasn't either, for the Feast of Purim was not instituted by the Lord. It was instituted by Esther and Mordecai as a remembrance of how the Jews were delivered from the hand of the evil Haman. Was it wrong for the Jews to celebrate this? No, as long as this didn't become a religious requirement in order to be faithful to God. But didn't the command go out that all future generations of Jews commemorate this holiday? Yes, but as a secular feast and civic holiday. Nothing necessarily stopped any Jew from not observing Purim, for no edict of God was broken. However, the Jews observed it because it was an important part of their history of the nation. The same is true today. In the United States, each year on Thanksgiving, the president proclaims it to be a national day of Thanksgiving, directing all Americans to observe it as such. What happens if I don't? Nothing, for it's a civic holiday, one that doesn't come with punishment for those who don't observe the day as such. Now, if the president declared that all churches must add Thanksgiving as a holy day to their liturgical calendar in order to not be persecuted by the government, then that would be something different. For although Christians are to be thankful to God always, He has not set up Thanksgiving as a religious holiday, and so Christians should not observe it as such. As we learned when we studied Romans, the observance of days is a liberty given to each Christian. Whether we observe something as a holiday is completely up to us. So long as we don't bind those days on others, and so long as we don't view those days as necessary for one to be faithful to God. So too with the Feast of Purim. It commemorated an actual event, an event of a national deliverance by God, something we'll discuss in the next lesson. There was therefore nothing wrong with celebrating that, even if it wasn't a feast of the Lord commanded under the law of Moses. For the Jews, by commemorating it, it should remind future generations of the past on how God worked for the good of the Jews in order to accomplish His ultimate purpose, the bringing to earth, through the seed of Abraham, the Messiah. Now for the Jews today, they don't believe that the Messiah was Jesus, but the New Testament proves that He was. Thus, even though Christians don't celebrate Purim each year, we can at least have a little more understanding about why it is celebrated, and why our ultimate salvation is rooted in the events that it commemorates. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Esther chapter 10, verses 1 to 3, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.